My name is Laura Terry Green, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce Paula Madison. I had the privilege of serving as her college intern at NBC Universal, so it's an honor to have her here today. Paula currently serves as the chairman and CEO of Madison Media Management, a Los Angeles-based global media consultancy company. Paula previously served as Executive Vice President of Diversity at NBC Universal and Vice President of General Electric, the then parent company. Paula is the recipient of numerous high-profile honors and awards, and she was the former franchise owner of the WNBA's Los Angeles Sparks basketball team. Paula is the executive producer of Finding Samuel Lowe, From Harlem to China, a compelling documentary that chronicles her journey to discovering more about her heritage. Her memoirs, Finding Samuel Lowe, China, Jamaica, Harlem, were also published in April of last year. Paula's journey has been both extraordinary and compelling, and we are fortunate to have her here with us today. So, without further ado, I'd like to bring up Ms. Paula Madison.
Hello. So thank you for coming. And I don't know, I think I'm supposed to talk to you about the strange trajectory of my life and have you ask some questions, and I'll try to answer them. But what I like to do at the very beginning, although you saw video of me, but I like to do at the very beginning so that we get past this thing, which is, does she look Chinese to you? So what I like to do at the very beginning, I'm going to remove my glasses and you take a look for yourself, and then stop being distracted and pay attention to what I'm saying. So here we go. This is your moment. Okay, there you go. Now you can answer for yourself, but pay attention. So I've had, as Laura said, I had a pretty varied life, and you saw it a little bit in the clip there where my brothers and I talked about, my oldest brother talked about, you know, where we grew up in Harlem. And, you know, my mother was the first person in our family, or so I thought, the first person in our family to come to the United States. She came in 1945 under the Chinese immigration quota. It's when the Chinese Exclusion Act was eased. How many people know about the Chinese Exclusion Act? Yeah. So a lot of folks don't know that the only nation on the planet that the United States has actually passed laws to keep that particular nation's residents from establishing, its citizens from establishing residency in the United States is China. And beginning in the 1880s with some regular frequency, Congress passed a series of laws to keep Chinese people from being citizens and residents of the United States. They could come and work. Oh, yeah, so they built the Transcontinental Railroad from the west. You know that famous picture in Promontory, Utah? Which really wasn't in Promontory, which says a whole lot. But when they're driving in that final stake, you know, connecting the east and the west, there's a lot of people in that picture kind of taking credit and being really proud that we got this done. And not one person in that photo is Chinese, when in fact, the majority of the workers were Chinese. Many of them were Hakka. I was explaining to Laura at lunch today, you know, my multiculturalism and my multiracial background, which I don't know a whole lot of people who don't have some kind of multiracial background. But in my case, it seems to be, you know, some surprise that Black and Chinese, that's actually very common, particularly in the Caribbean and particularly throughout Central and Latin America. The Chinese people and Indians who got to the Caribbean, which all blended, which gives some people on some of the islands a so-called exotic look, came about because of the abolition of slavery. How does that feed in, you ask? Well, in 1838, when the British abolished slavery in its territories, the Africans who were no longer enslaved said, for love or money, we're not cutting any more sugarcane for you. So they wouldn't work for you. And so the owners of the plantations, of the sugar plantations, got the next cheapest labor. They brought indentured workers from India and China. And the first Chinese arrived in Jamaica in 1854. Now, they didn't generally let them bring their women nor their families. So who can resist the beauty of Jamaican women? Certainly not my grandfather. So my grandfather actually had 2 African Jamaican women with whom he had children. And my mother was separated from her father when she was 3 years old. The picture of the woman who you saw who looked there were 2 photos side by side. One looked like a kind of Chinese woman and the other one was a black man. Those were my parents. And I became very, very, very aware as a little girl about racial distinctions, differences. And I became very, very, very aware because my mother, who had been taken from her father when she was 3 years old and never saw him again, this is how the break in my family happened. My mother, when I was born, so I was the last child and I was the only girl. So the first 2 were boys who were welcomed. Why would you think they'd be welcomed? Chinese culture. Chinese culture, boys love boys, girls not so much. That would be why in some parts of the country, in certain eras in history, you would see whites with strollers with little Chinese girls because the Chinese girls were given up for adoption. They weren't really wanted. My mother didn't give me up for adoption, no. But my mother's hair was down to here. My mother recoiled from my hair, like, oh my God, what am I going to do with that? And so what was interesting was when my mother was 3 years old, her mother, while she kept her from being raised with her Chinese father, her mother didn't want her because she was mixed race. And there was a certain amount of shame associated with that in Jamaica, particularly when you're not with your Chinese family. So my grandmother, who I only met once in my life, pretty much deposited my mother with her grandmother. And my mother said every day her grandmother would call her, "You half Chinese wretch." That was, I guess, her affectionate name for her granddaughter. And so my mother grew up between cultures. She looked Chinese, was being raised by African Jamaicans, and nobody wanted her, except her Chinese father, who could not find her. When I was a little girl, my mother, who had grown up in this kind of an environment, looked at me, the last child and the only girl, and had no idea what to do with my hair. Now, I don't know that I necessarily want to define this whole conversation around hair, but here's how it starts. Most little black girls had the experience of sitting either on their mother's lap or between their mother's legs and having their hair combed and braided. I never had that experience till I was 6 years old. Not that I walked around with this wild hair, no. But my mother bussed me upstairs to a nice lady from North Carolina who combed my hair until I was about 6. And I think that kind of created an interesting but a little bit strained relationship between me and my mother. Because just as my mother didn't have a woman who looked like her to identify with, right? I grew up in Harlem with my mother, absolutely in the house. But the identification, the multi-racialism in our household made things kind of interesting. So when I said earlier that I was very aware of racial distinctions from a very early age, and you heard that I ended up becoming the Chief Diversity Officer for NBC Universal, before that I had a long and storied journalism career. I ran the news department for NBC4 in New York City. There's so many, I'm 63 years old, there's so many firsts that I could tell you, but you'd be bored, and I'm bored by even. But what I can say to you is that once I did all those kinds of things, I had a boss who said, well, you know, don't retire early, stay on. I want you to run diversity at NBC Universal. And I was like, oh, no, not gonna do it. Because I'm not good at being a consultant. I'm not good at telling people, I think you should do this, but then they ignore you, which in many instances is what happens when you are leading diversity. Rarely does a diversity person report to the CEO. But in my case, because I'm somewhat strange and demanding, unless I reported to the CEO, we're not even talking. So I reported to the CEO. But I still said no. And about 2 weeks before that, my family, and nobody at my company knew this because it was not their business, we were independently wealthy. Why do you work? Why not? So I had planned to retire early, and an individual approached my family about investing in the Los Angeles Sparks, the WNBA team. And I was like, no, we like basketball, we watch basketball, but that's a business that, you know, I don't know that business. And my brothers didn't know that business. But in a short amount of time, like a week later, this radio personality by the name of Don Imus referred to the Rutgers women's basketball team as nappy-headed, I won't say the word. It starts with an H, not an N. It actually starts with a W, but you know, in street parlance, you know. So you're right. So after that happened, I was like moved to do two things. One, I decided not to retire early because I was really mad. And two, I went to the little kids in my family and said, hey, you guys want to own a basketball team? Yeah! Well, how about we buy the LA Sparks? Yeah! And that's how we got into basketball. It's probably the worst emotional decision I ever made. Not because I didn't enjoy it, and not because I didn't love basketball, not because I didn't love our team, because all of that I did. But when you have a team, and although we had the only television contract in the league, local television contract in the league, although we had the highest attendance in the league, you just can't make a WNBA team profitable. It's a whole different conversation. So when you have a business that's not profitable, what is it? It's called a hobby. So I sold the team to Magic Johnson. And, but what it did help me do was when I realized that there are actually people walking the planet who feel very comfortable saying what Don Imus said, not just in a room, you know, but it was broadcast to millions. Well, I thought that I should make him pay for that. I thought that I should make somebody learn from that, and so I decided to stay on. I decided to not retire. And I actually had somebody ask me once, well, you know, did working in television and in news and all that, you know, prepare you for being the chief diversity officer? And I was like, no. Having my mother look the way my mother looked as a single parent growing up in Harlem, that's what prepared me. We used to hang out. You know, I went to Catholic school, I went to Catholic school, and it was in the days where everybody just hung out all the time. You played in the park, you just double dutch, ring alivio. We just played New York City street games. And everything would be fine and cool and not an issue until my mother would come outside. My mother would come outside at summertime. Paula, come in for dinner. And depending upon who I was playing with, if that person already knew my family and knew my mother, it'd be cool. Okay, I'm gonna go and eat, I'll be back. But if the person wasn't familiar with what he or she was looking at, and usually it was a she, it'd be like, who's that? Response, that's my mother. Next statement could either be, oh, then we're cool. Sometimes the statement would be, that is not your mother. Derogatory term used to describe Chinese people. What's the reasonable response? You punch them in the face. That was my reasonable response. So when I was 9, 10, 11 years old, this is the kind, I don't even think I took the time to ask, what did you say? What did you say? Because at that point, you're kind of like an amoeba. You're just responsive. Press that. So somebody would say that, and, and by the way, my mother was not what one would think of, the sort of, retiring Chinese woman. My mother didn't grow up like that. I have one anecdote to tell you, and I'm going to get to the point of all of this. My one anecdote is that when my oldest brother was about 13 years old, he got into a fight with a kid who lived like 4 blocks away. And this kid came from a large family, and we had no other relatives around. It was my mother and her 3 children. And this kid and my brother got into a fight at the gym, and my brother beat him up. They were same age, same size. And in finality, the guy ran and left his sneakers, and those being the spoils of war, my brother picked up the sneakers and brought them home. He was never going to wear them, but he was probably going to. So before all that could happen, in our neighborhood, we had neighborhood runners. These are people who, they're announcing something big is happening. So we had a first floor apartment, and everybody's doors were always open. So you could hear this kid running down the street, Miss Nell, this man's coming. He's going to come. He's coming. He's going to beat up Elric. So here's my mother. My mother grabbed the meat cleaver. There was not a blade in my house that was not sharp. My mother picked up the meat cleaver. She said to my oldest brother, Elric, get the bat. That was a baseball bat. She said, Howard, get the handcuffs. Those were handcuffs from, I think, the First World War. They were iron, and they were really heavy, and if you held one side and you swung it around like a bolo, you would kill someone. So Howard had the handcuffs. Paula, bring the cat. So we had a cat, Frisky. And Frisky was very kind and gentle until you tossed her. And then Frisky's claws would and she would not stop clawing. So Paula, bring the cat. Sorry, I brought the cat. So we all go outside, and this man who's about more than 6 feet tall with 4 of his sons, they come down the street. And my mother is on the stoop, the stoop, in front of the tenement. And she's like this. Oh, it would be on the other side. Sorry. Well, because she's right-handed. So my mother's leaning, and she's like this. And the gentleman walks up with his sons, and he says to his son, is that the kid? The kid goes, yeah. And he says, and before anything else could happen, my mother was at his throat, holding it, and had the meat cleaver against his jugular. Now, the people in my neighborhood, they knew Miss Nell, and they knew she was not to be messed with. My mother taught me as a little girl that if you get into a fight, don't stop until the other person can't get up. Now, you would think, what? Who tells their child? Single mother in Harlem, and we were the only people in our neighborhood who came from what today is referred to as a broken family. Everybody else back then, the mother and father lived in the home. We were the only ones who that wasn't the case. Plus, our mother looked like, who is that? Like, what is she doing here? So my mother comes from, on the Chinese side, she is Hakka. And the Hakka women are the only women in China who culturally never bound their feet. The culture of Hakka people is that the women didn't bind their feet. Do you know what foot binding is supposed to mean? It's beauty, tiny feet. So they break your feet when you're little, and they wrap them and bind them. And if your feet are stumps, you can't walk. Now, the only way that you can actually survive is if you're wealthy enough to have someone carry you. So foot binding was a sign of beauty and wealth. Hakka women have always been industrious. Hakka means, I guess in a nice way, I'd say guest people. They started out in northern China, and through wars and dislocation and whatever, they ended up moving down and down and down into the farthest part of China, which is the southeasternmost province, Guangdong province. And everywhere the Hakka people went, they went in a band. They'd mix with the local people, but they'd build their houses and then build walls around them. They'd build their villages because they were always at war. So Hakka women are the only women who didn't bind their feet, and they fought alongside Hakka men. So that's one side. The other side is Jamaica. More than 94% of the people in Jamaica are Akan or Ashanti, present-day Ghana. And there are people culturally in Jamaica who are known as the Maroons. It's a variation of the Spanish word cimarrones, which means the wild ones. So these Maroons were the people who would come down from the mountains. They'd attack the slave owners, and of course kill them. And they'd kill any slaves who wouldn't join them. So after a period of time, the governor of the island was told by the King of England, you got to do a treaty with these people to make them stop killing us. And so they signed a treaty, and the Maroons said, okay, we promise. We won't kill you guys anymore. In exchange for that, they were given land in the hills of Jamaica, and the treaty lasted about a year, and they started killing them again. And that is why the British stopped bringing slaves to Jamaica to be broken in, because it didn't work. And the Jamaicans are generally known as a pretty surly group. We are, I guess, prideful and pugnacious. Yeah, I think so. And so the two most famous Maroons who you would be familiar with are probably Bob Marley and Marcus Garvey. And that would be why, by the way, the United States did not give Jamaicans immigration rights for many years into this country. They suspended them because the Jamaicans are very unruly people. Yay for us. Okay, so having said that, on both sides of my mother's lineage, she comes from a warrior group. So the fighting and teaching her children to fight was natural. But what also would happen would be, we talked about race and multiculturalism all the time. So given how my mother looked, right, this man walked up on her son and he thought it was all going to be okay. My mother held him here and had the meat cleaver at his neck and said, what are you doing here? And I remember it like it was yesterday. And this man, he was like, she said, talk. Why are you here? And he said, I came to get my son's sneakers. And she said, no, you didn't. You thought you were going to hurt my son. And she said, I'll kill you right in front of your children. Even I was like, whoa, Ma. Not that I said anything out loud, because I never, no. Because when Nell was in that, all you wanted to do was breathe gently. So it ultimately ended with her telling him to leave, and he did. My brother gave back the sneakers, but what it did was establish reputation. It cemented my mother's reputation. My mother was known for, that's not a woman who you want to mess with. Counter to, I think, the stereotype that a lot of people had about Chinese people, and certainly Chinese people in Harlem. And there weren't very many. And I don't, this is truly not stereotypical, but most of the time when we encountered Chinese people, they owned the Chinese laundry or they had the Chinese restaurant. And that was pretty much it. What my mother made certain of was, because I think she was treated the way she was treated when she was a child, if you ask my mother, what are you? She would say, I'm Jamaican. Yeah, but, and she'd say, well, now depending upon the era, she'd say, I'm colored, or I'm Negro, or I'm black. Why? Because my mother identified with her children, which is what no one did for her. My mother made us into a tribe, and the tribe she made us into was this tribe. I forgot one other anecdote. When I was in 3rd grade, I came home from school, Catholic school. I had my little report card. I handed it to my mother. I was always the A student, always the A student. I didn't know how not to be an A student. I handed my report card. She looks at me and leaned in, not Sheryl Sandberg leaning in, by the way. She leaned into my face and she said, I did not come to this country for you to get a B. Changes your whole life. Generally, children of immigrants totally get that. So the expectation for my mother was, regardless of how she looked, whatever her racial presentation was, her expectations for her children had nothing to do with traditionally how we were expected to perform. Because among the things that my mother told us was that children perform frequently to the level that adults expect them to perform. So my mother didn't know. My mother had only gone as far as second form. And my mother taught us how to read when we were 3 years old using what? The New York Herald Tribune newspaper. Are you supposed to teach kids how to read at 3 years old with a daily newspaper? It's what my mother had to read. Consequently, that's what we had to read. My mother had every expectation that she came to the United States and it was our responsibility to fulfill her dream. And what was her dream? Children of immigrants. Children of immigrants from the South to the North. What's the dream? To be wealthy. To be wealthy. To take advantage of what's offered in this country. The streets are paved with gold. I mean, when you're living in another country, sometimes these things don't seem so far-fetched. When you're living in another country and you hear that the child of so-and-so grew up to, run Standard Oil, or the child of so-and-so grew up to become president, or the child of so-and-so, owned the railroad. These things actually happened in the United States of America. So why would an immigrant think that it couldn't happen for her children? So my mother's insistence was, nobody can take away your education, and I came to this country for you to be wealthy. You grow up to be wealthy, I'm going to pull your tongue out of your head. Yes, mommy. And so the level of expectation, we became independently wealthy at a pretty early age, because what she said was, no one can take your education away, and oh, by the way, if someone tries to prevent you from achieving what you need to achieve, you have to do what I tell you to do. And in her mind, my mother's motto was, and I can't bang on my chest because I can because of the microphone. My mother would say, they have to kill me first. So that's how we grew up. We're either going to get it done and you get out of my way, or you're going to have to kill me first. So with all of that, I ended up with a great sensitivity to racial distinctions. I grew up understanding how and why, coming from two sides of my family. There are two sides of my family, my lineage, where there were lynchings in the United States of my people. On the black side, absolutely, and on the Chinese side. And many people in this country do not know that Chinese people were lynched. The miscegenation laws which were passed in this country, most people think it was to keep the blacks and whites from mixing. Well, it was, but it was also used to keep the Chinese railroad workers and others, and in other labor positions, from mixing with Caucasian women. And here in California, what we don't have in California is what we have in the Caribbean. My grandfather had 3 women who he had children by in Jamaica. 2 were African Jamaican, and 1 was a Chinese bride that his parents sent from China, sight unseen, for him to marry. An obedient son that he was, he married. And they had so my grandfather's total offspring, there were 8. The first 3 were biracial. 1 was by my grandmother, and 2 was by another woman, Emma Allison, and the other 5 was by the Chinese bride who he married, Ho Sui Yin. And the whole point of what was happening in the Caribbean, which was people mixed, in the United States, there were Chinese men who were lynched for mixing with white women or thinking they would. And they pretty much got their point across early. So instead, who did the Chinese men mix with? Because they weren't able to bring their wives and families. Latinas, a lot of Mexicans. You hear in Latino culture, people referred to as Chino, nicknamed Chino. Good number of Chinese mixed with Mexicans, Native Americans. Oh, and African Americans. Throughout California, we've had generations of different races mixing with Chinese. And a lot of people are like, what? So among the things that I try to do is have this conversation out loud, because what we're seeing happening these days is the changing of this country demographically in ways that for some people it's just happening, and for other people it's quite alarming. I'm not even going to talk about the politics of today. I will not. I'm going to stay away from that. But I want you to understand that there's an expectation that the way California looks today, or the big cities in California, LA and San Francisco, is what the entire country is going to look like in the next 25 years. And for some of us, it's like, yay. Why? Because I guess maybe contrary to how my mother's grandmother treated her, I find that these days when you're in a mixed race environment and there is love involved and children are produced, it's kind of hard for the grandparents to reject the child. I don't usually see that happening. I usually see the grandparents embrace and love the baby because love is love. I bring all this up because notice how much I've been talking about race? I bring all this up because I'll bet you all don't often talk about race across lines. And when I ran the news department for NBC in New York, I was assistant news director. I was the number 2 person in the news department before I eventually became the boss. But when I first entered the news department, there was an event going on, the Central Park Jogger case. Have you heard of that? And simultaneously, there was a case going on where two young African-American men, they were driving along the highway in New York going to JFK, leading from JFK Airport, and their car broke down. And so they pulled off onto the side of the road, as long as before there were cell phones. And they walked into the neighborhood because they were looking for a payphone to get a tow truck. And they walked into a neighborhood that wasn't welcoming to young black men. And so this group of white teens chased them down. They ran them down. The young black men ran back onto the highway to get to their car, and while running, one of them fell and was hit by a car and killed. So that young man's name was Yusef Hawkins. I don't know if you are aware of that one. So simultaneously, we had Central Park Jogger, we had Yusef Hawkins. I had been in the newsroom for maybe 3 weeks as assistant news director. And at the time, I was very disturbed about the language that was being used to describe these events. So I got the scripts for the 6 o'clock and the 11 o'clock newscasts, and I redacted the names of who had written what reporter, what anchor, what producer, nobody knew who. But I made copies of them, and I gathered those communities of people, and I said, here, read these. So I'm new, and they're like, what? I said, no, just read them. We're going to talk about it. Oh, God. So they're reading, okay, what? And I said, well, I'd just like for you to notice that in some of the scripts, people are referred to as pack of wolves. Some people are referred to as committing something called wilding. And in some of the stories, they're just referred to as a gang of youths. Now, what I note is that the descriptions that deal with people in beast terms and animalistic terms refer to the Central Park Jogger case. And the gang of youths are the white kids who chased down 2 black teens who just were looking to call a tow truck. Why are we doing that? And they were mortified. Mortified because with no intent to be racist and to use racist language and terms, that's exactly what was happening. Or you can bet that people weren't slouching in their seats after that. And what I'd said was, the absolute worst time to have discussions around race is when a racist incident occurs. Because if you're not familiar with the language, if you're not sensitive to how people are going to take things, like, that is not your mama. Well, I was 9, 10, yeah, I'm going to punch you in your face. But as now I'm an adult, there's got to be another way of handling it, right? There's got to be another way of handling it, right? So what I used to do when I ran the news department in New York is I deliberately would have conversations around race every day when nothing was, and people learned how to be respectful and discuss race and culture. The multiculturalism of this country and the increasing demographic changes in this country, more in the direction of people of color, really does require that although we are colleagues, and some of us are even friends, there may come a moment where it's tested. And if you've never, ever had that conversation in a non-racially explosive circumstance, it could get a little sticky. When I was talking with Laura, I said, well, maybe you guys should have, like weekly, somebody just sit in that, what's it, Charlie's Cafe? I got it right. And do brown bag lunch. Oh, wait, you guys don't have to pay for lunch. You don't need brown bag lunches. What am I talking about? And have people, because in this room, listening in, everybody has at least one story. And I don't mean that it has to be some scary story, but you actually are working with people who you think you know reasonably well. And how many of us are really sharing who we are? How many of us are really talking about our culture and our background? How many of us are actually sharing, and I'll go into the thing about black women because I'm that, is, one of the things that black women frequently get tagged with is, well, she's kind of harsh. She's tough. And I like to call her Sapphire. What? And when I worked at GE, and we had a women's ERG group, which was massive, and we had one that was for blacks. Well, we had them for everybody. But the one that I talked about Sapphire in was the one that when I brought just the black women together. And how many of them I asked were told that they had attitude problems? Well, you need to tone that down some. Well, I would tell people, I would tell women, I would tell black women, make up something. What do you mean? Say you went to listen to some jazz over the weekend. Say you went to a soccer game. Okay, you didn't. But you can't follow the adage that we've all been told. Don't be telling people your business. Because all of us have been told, and see, she's laughing. All of us have been told by our mothers and our grandmothers and our aunties, don't be telling these people your business. Don't tell them. Well, when you don't, you're not opening up. You're not, how do you get to be on the team if you don't tell some of your business? I told none of my business. I made up stuff. Yeah, I went down to Central Park Summer Stage this weekend. It was great. I didn't see you there. Were you there? Oh, yeah, I was at the early show. Because you have to give something. I can't be telling, I was still living in Harlem and, well, let me leave it alone. But what I'm saying is that, and I hope you're following where I'm going with this. It's important. It really is important, particularly for those of you who are working in this new frontier, Google land, you Googlers. It's a brand new frontier for you. If we called you pioneers, I would put it in the context of then don't do the same old stupid stuff that people were doing before. This is an opportunity. I just learned you don't have to do your own dry cleaning. You ain't got to pay for lunch. You all get driven to work in some big white bus. I'm like, do you know this is not the real world? And given all of that opportunity to use your whatever for whatever, maybe one of the things that can happen is you can be on the cutting edge of fostering a better level of interaction, greater quality of whether it's camaraderie or actual friendship. Okay, one last anecdote and then I'll take a question. My last anecdote is when I was a new newspaper reporter, reasonably new. I was sitting at my desk and the hotshot reporters, all of whom were white males, were standing at my desk, and I'm writing whatever I'm writing, and they're sitting there chatting. And one of them said, yeah, man, it was like a Chinese fire drill. Caught my ear. I'm like, oh, what is that? So, inquisitive person that I am, I said, hey, what's a Chinese fire drill? Oh, you know what a Chinese fire drill is. No, actually, I don't. Oh, it's like, when you were in high school and you were driving a car. I said, I grew up in Harlem on welfare. It would not be driving a car. No, it's the subway and the bus. So I don't know what you're talking about. So, well, you pull up to a light. There's like the car's full, like 4 people. Everybody opens the doors, a red light. Everybody runs around the car and they get back in. And why is that a Chinese fire drill? And literally, guy says, oh, Chinese people, ching, chong, bong, bong. Who can understand what that? It's confusion. At which point, I stood up to my full height. And I became 11 years old again. I didn't hit him. But I said, if you say that around me again, I'm going to you up. That's me against 4 white guys, right? 4 guys, and it's me, and I'm new. And they looked at me. And I said, because here's what I know. What I know is that when I'm not present, the slur you're going to use is going to be about people who look like me. So my advice to you is don't do it at all. At which point, I sat back down. I said, oh, by the way, my grandfather was Chinese. They're like, oh, God, whatever. So it's important. It really is important in this day and age that race, gender, culture, nationality, all the above, is taken into account in a variety of social environments. And you all spend more time with each other than you spend with people you love, unless you love somebody at work, which could be a little dicey. So I would only suggest that what you think about, particularly because you do have the opportunity to come together in various groupings and settings to talk about how to get past and over this hump and make it a more meaningful social interaction. Questions? Thank you. If anybody does have a question, and I hope you do, there's a microphone there that you have to talk into so that the people out there and, the disembodied out there can hear what the question is.
Hi there. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
And as a Greek-American woman from Philadelphia, I can resonate with some of the things you were saying about being called a little harsh, a little this, a little that. So thank you for those comments.
Sure.
So my question for you, I've also lived through the 90s, right? In the 90s, I think of that as a time when people were aware of the language they used, but what resulted was the era of PC, which I personally wasn't a fan of, because we were all being so careful that everyone was afraid to talk. And I don't really have any interest in that. So I agree that dialogue is important, and I agree that we have to talk about these things. And I loved the point you made about having the conversation in a non-heated moment, because I think that's not something I've thought about before, and I think that's incredibly useful. How do we do that without ending up with people who are maybe a little less comfortable with that conversation, then feeling like they can't speak at all, which ruins the point?
Right. Great question. Tell me your name.
I'm Ann.
Ann. Thank you for that. So, when I was 51, I started running marathons. I know, because I'm crazy. And I didn't know you could train to run a marathon. I was like, wow, a coach, really? I know how to run. It's like you just run. It's like, no. It's a different kind of running. So my husband, who by then had already run like 9 or 10 marathons, he's like, baby, listen. He said, I've only ever seen you run for the train. And I said, and? He said, do you know how long a marathon is? I said, 26.2 miles. I know how long it is. He said, well, maybe you should start with like a 5K. I said, are you trying to discourage me? No. And I said, what's a K? Truly, that's true conversation. So I had a running partner who, lovely woman, one of my dearest friends now, and she's probably 10, 12 years older than me, and she's Jewish. And while running, we talked about all kinds of things. It's really hard to be really mad at somebody when today is a 12-mile run. You understand? You figure out whether it's quilting, whether it's playing Minecraft, whatever it is that's the common bond, and then you get beyond the superficial. Yeah, we talked about cookies and grandchildren, of course. But there would be points where we got into some really meaningful, serious, and potentially dangerous discussions, but we had enough trust in each other to know that, this is not cocktail party banter. We're really, and she is one of my dearest and closest friends. It's hard not to be friends with somebody who you're sweating on. Well, I think. But anyway, you get my, it can't be sitting across from each other at work while we both have a bottle of water and I want to talk to you about, it's too focused, it's too whatever. And in an environment like this, quite honestly, the best way to have these conversations is to have them moderated or brokered. Have somebody who really does know how to encourage the discussion and can tell when it may be getting, so talk about what you meant by that as opposed to, what did you mean by that? Yeah. Yes.
So that was a really interesting point, and you're talking about having a moderator in a group, but how can you kind of organically facilitate that? Because my assumption, and this, I guess is a generalization, is that the people who are already somewhat interested in that already are the ones who attend, right? And so we don't need a homogenous group to consistently have this conversation.
Right.
You kind of want to spread it to the group that maybe doesn't have any interest in attending. So how do you have that organically happen without forcing someone to go to a round table or something?
Right, I don't believe you can have it happen organically.
You cannot have it.
I don't think you can organically have people say, today, let's talk about the scary issue about, I don't think that organically that can happen. I think that it has to be purposeful. I think that there has to be a decision made somewhere along the line, whether it comes out of HR, whether it comes out of a management group, whether it comes out of somewhere, but somebody who says, look, this is my first time at Google. The only person I know at Google is Laura, and maybe some of you now. But if this is an environment where you get your clothes cleaned, you get your laundry done, I don't even know what else you all get for free. But if it's designed to enrich, if it's designed to smooth and tamp down distractions so you can have an enriched, more effective and efficient experience here, look at what you're not discussing. Look at what is not being discussed at all. And how much more risk, and it is risky, no question. When I was at NBC Universal, we brought everybody together in something called NBC Unity Day. And we dealt with a lot of these things with the blessing and the encouragement of the tip-top most management. Because you can't just make this up and say, yeah, so now every Wednesday we're going to gather. Because without it being moderated, and it could get real dicey. So the premise of organic, I don't think it can be organic, not at work.
I actually have an alternative there. My name's Marjay. Thank you so much for coming, Ms. Madison. This was an incredible lecture. But we do have a group here that was created organically in some way called Equality Working Group. So if you go to your internal Google group and look that alias up, we have monthly lunches where people of all types from Google, we come together and have lunch. And it's really great because you're engaging with people who you would probably never talk to because a lot of us, we silo ourselves in every way of people who look like us or talk like us or think like us. So it's a really cool way for different people to get together to engage. And we talk a lot about race and gender issues and things like that. And people ask questions. They're like, well, why does a Black person feel this way? They just, they just don't know. And they need some help to kind of understand and walk through someone else's shoes to understand that. And so we put ourselves in this really safe environment where we can do this here at Google. So I'd encourage you guys to look up the working group and come have lunch sometime.
I think that's great if you all have been able to come together and pretty much, maybe I'm not, I don't know what the word, but leave any kind of hostility that could come from that at the door. Mm-hmm. My experience is that it can get there really quickly if not. Sure. But if what you all have done is create that environment, I think I applaud you, because that's spectacular. That's a rare thing to happen. So maybe free lunches and free cleaning does make you nicer.
Yeah, and I think the great thing here is that, like you were saying, how do we bring people, because you're right, people come who are naturally, they want to engage in this way, but there's a lot of people who probably don't come because they're in the exact opposite feeling. So we encourage everyone to bring somebody who would never come to this if you weren't their friend, and encourage them to. So you should
be applauded for that. I don't know if you all have in-house communications. Tell me how much more time we have. I don't know if you have in-house communications, but maybe you can let people know that happens.
Yeah.
And because that, I think, is a game changer. Having worked in so many places and in so many different roles throughout my life, what I have found is that it's tough. It's real, and people, it gets sometimes stuck right here. There's, oh, sorry, I do have one more anecdote. And again, I'm sorry, all my anecdotes involve violence. I apologize. When I was in college, which was many moons ago, there was an African-American student and a white student, and they both lived in the same dorm, both women. And the white student said to the African-American, and they in the bathroom, they were in the bathroom, and she said, "Oh, can I touch your hair?" And the black student said, "No." And the white student said, "No, but I just want to touch it." And the black student said, "Don't touch my hair." She actually was trimming her afro at the time. And the white student reached out and touched her hair, and the black student stabbed her in the hand. Right? So what I'm getting at is what may be comfortable for some people, so with my friend, my marathon partner, we would have conversations about stuff, and I'd say, you can't be just talking to every black person about this, right? I mean, you gotta go slowly, but don't be walking up to people who you barely know and say, "Hey," because it could go very wrong. So that's what I'm saying. You all have created an environment in your group where, there are ground rules, and there are people around who could serve as referees and moderators who are inside the group, because somehow you all have come to an agreement that this is how we're all going to conduct ourselves, which I applaud you for. I think that's spectacular.
Thanks. And I did want to give one more anecdote, because I think it's something that...
Does yours involve violence?
It involves racism in the workplace. But I had an experience. I work in advertising here at Google, and I talk on the phone with companies a lot, and marketing reps and things. And I was confused for, I guess, the person I was talking to thought I was a white person. So, and this happened twice in my 5 years here at Google. And they started to say something racist. The first call was about Muslims, and then the other one was about black people, they assuming I was white. So I really encourage people to be allies to all races, because that was the first time in my life I was able to actually fight and support a minority. Being a minority, that doesn't happen to me, but in this unique situation, I had the power to actually say, well, that's not right, because here they are thinking I'm white. And so when you are speaking with your peers, you have a lot more power to change the narrative than you do when you are usually the one that's disenfranchised. Because a lot of times it goes out one ear and out the other when you're the person being disenfranchised, speaking about your situation. So I really encourage allies of everyone to really speak out, because it actually gets through deeper than I think it might otherwise.
And I have a question. Did you tell in the situation where it was something racist towards black people, did you tell the person you're black?
Nope.
Yeah.
I didn't, because I wanted him because he felt bad when I actually was speaking in support of black people. So it took for him. He was like, "Oh, well, I guess maybe I didn't think of it in that way.
So you think you think it was more effective
more
for him to
effective.
think you were white?
Yeah, I think it was more
correct him?
effective for him to continue to think I was white. And then my manager told me to never talk to him again.
That's tough when you're doing business with people. I mean, sometimes you don't have that option, but I appreciate it. Well, thank you very much. Thank you for that. And so that actually was the last question. I should tell you that, so I'll be back there in a minute. If you're interested in the book, which is very multi-layered and multifaceted. And by the way, at the very end of it, we went to China, and 300 of my grandfather's direct descendants welcomed the 20 of us Black Chinese into the family. And so we have a long documented legacy in my family on the Chinese side. I'm actually the 151st generation of the Lowe clan, and my family's documented history goes back to 1006 BC. And yet, on my African Jamaican side, I can't find documents past grandparents. So, but having said all that, I would just like for you to understand that while I talked about my documented lineage, my undocumented lineage goes back farther than that, because the first man and woman were African. In fact, so we all came from that continent. So I just like to put into perspective that while, oh yay, I can look up the people in my family for many, many years back in our Chakpoo, but the start of mankind began in Africa. So with that, I thank you very much. Thank you for having me. And thank you, Laura, for inviting me. My little intern grew up. Yay!